Standing in the marble-floored auction hall of Sotheby's Aspen branch, I felt the familiar sting of humiliation wash over me as my sister Jessica's voice cut through the sophisticated murmur of wealthy bidders. "Oh, look, the broke girl showed up at the auction." Her words dripped with the same condescension she'd perfected since childhood, designed to make me feel small and worthless. My parents, Harold and Patricia, erupted in laughter, their amusement echoing off the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. Cousin Bradley joined their mockery with a smirk that made my stomach clench. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the room, calling for opening bids on the $8 million Snowmass estate. My heart pounded as I gripped my bidding paddle, knowing what I was about to do would shatter their world forever. The opulent auction house buzzed with the energy of Colorado's elite, their designer clothing and carefully styled appearances creating an atmosphere of privilege that my family felt they belonged to. Massive oil paintings of mountain landscapes adorned the walls while servers in crisp white uniforms circulated with champagne flutes and canapes. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with the leather-bound catalogs everyone clutched, creating an intoxicating blend that spoke of old money and new fortunes. My arrival had clearly surprised them. Jessica wore a burgundy silk dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon that showcased diamond earrings catching the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. She'd positioned herself near the front, confident in her ability to intimidate other bidders with her presence. Patricia, my mother, had chosen a navy Chanel suit that emphasized her still trim figure. At 58, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her expression radiating the superiority she'd cultivated through decades of social climbing. Harold, my father, stood behind them wearing a charcoal Tom Ford suit, his salt and pepper beard meticulously groomed. His eyes held the calculating look I'd grown to recognize whenever money was involved. Cousin Bradley, Jessica's constant companion in cruelty, had opted for a more casual but equally expensive ensemble, his khakis and blazer screaming Ivy League privilege. They'd been obsessing over the Snowmass estate for months, ever since it came on the market following the death of tech mogul William Thornton. The 20-acre property boasted a 12,000-square-foot main house, guest cottages, a private ski lift, and panoramic views of the Elk Mountains. For my family, owning it represented the ultimate status symbol, proof they'd finally achieved the level of wealth and prestige they'd always craved. Standing in my simple black dress from Target, clutching a worn leather purse, I looked nothing like the other bidders. My brown hair hung loose around my shoulders, unstyled and natural. No jewelry adorned my neck or wrists, no designer shoes clicked against the polished marble. To anyone observing, I appeared exactly as my family portrayed me, a poor relation who'd somehow stumbled into a world far beyond her means. But appearances can be deceiving. My internal monologue raced as memories flooded back of family gatherings where they'd dismissed my career as a social worker, mocked my small apartment in Denver, and constantly reminded me that I'd never amount to anything significant. They'd painted me as the family failure, the one who'd chosen a life of service over success, compassion over cash. For years, I'd internalized their criticism, believing maybe I really was the disappointment they claimed. The auctioneer, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, commanded attention from his wooden podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to present Lot 17, the magnificent Thornton Estate in Snowmass Village. This extraordinary property represents one of Colorado's most prestigious addresses, featuring unparalleled luxury and privacy." Jessica leaned toward our parents, whispering excitedly about renovation plans and hosting capabilities. Bradley pulled out his phone, likely calculating financing options. They'd discuss this purchase endlessly at family dinners, treating it as their inevitable destiny, rather than a competitive auction. None of them had noticed me slip inside during the previous lot's bidding. I'd deliberately chosen a seat in the back corner, partially hidden by a marble column, giving me perfect visibility while remaining unobtrusive. The bidding paddle in my hand bore number 237 obtained after providing the required financial documentation that had stunned the auction house staff. The auctioneer's assistant, a petite woman with auburn hair, distributed additional information packets to interested bidders. The estate's details were impressive. 8 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, a wine cellar that could hold 5,000 bottles, a home theater, indoor swimming pool, and outdoor hot tubs positioned to maximize mountain views. The property taxes alone exceeded what most families earned in a year. "We'll begin bidding at $4 million, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. Multiple paddles rose immediately, including Jessica's. The competition was fierce, with several phone bidders represented by auction house employees. My family's confidence remained unshaken as the price climbed steadily upward, their resources apparently adequate for the escalating amounts. At $6 million, several bidders dropped out their financial limits reached. Jessica's paddle remained raised her posture, radiating determination. Harold nodded approvingly while Patricia smiled with anticipation. They'd prepared for this moment, extensively arranging financing and liquidating other assets to ensure victory. $7 million eliminated more competitors, leaving only 5 active bidders, including my family. The tension in the room became palpable as fortunes prepared to change hands. Jessica's confidence never wavered, her paddle rising promptly with each increment. At $7.5 million, only 3 bidders remained active: my family, a mysterious phone bidder, and an elderly gentleman in the front row wearing an expensive watch that caught the light with each gesture. When the auctioneer called for $8 million, the elderly gentleman shook his head and lowered his paddle. 2 bidders remained, Jessica representing our family and the anonymous phone bidder, whose identity remained unknown to everyone in the room. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the culmination of 3 months of careful planning and painful discovery. My hand trembled slightly as I prepared to raise my paddle, knowing that everything would change in the next few seconds. The shocked expressions on my family's faces would be worth every dollar I was about to spend. The memory of discovering my family's betrayal still made my chest tighten with a pain so sharp it felt physical. 3 months earlier, I'd been sitting in Grandma Rose's Victorian house on 10th Street in Golden, Colorado, sorting through her medical supplies while she dozed fitfully in her hospital bed. The oncologist had given her weeks to live, and I'd taken family leave from my job at Denver Social Services to care for her during her final days. While my parents' sister and cousin made excuses about being too busy with their careers and social obligations, I'd moved into Grandma's guest bedroom to provide round-the-clock care. I helped her with medications, prepared her favorite meals despite her diminished appetite, and listened to her stories about growing up during the Great Depression when every penny mattered. Grandma Rose had built her wealth slowly and carefully, starting with a small inheritance from her own parents and investing wisely in Colorado real estate during the 1950s and 60s. She'd purchased several properties in what became prime Denver locations, holding them for decades, while their values multiplied exponentially. Her modest lifestyle and practical clothing had hidden the fact that she was worth several $1 million. The discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon when I was searching for her insurance documents in the antique desk she kept in her bedroom. The bottom drawer had always stuck, requiring extra force to open completely. As I tugged harder than usual, the drawer came out entirely, revealing a hidden compartment behind it that contained a small fireproof safe I'd never seen before. Inside that safe, along with her jewelry and important papers, I found documents that made my hands shake as I read them. The original, will dated 18 months earlier, and properly notarized, clearly stated her intentions: $2 million in cash and investments would go to me, along with the mineral rights to her family's original homestead property in Clear Creek County. The rest would be divided among other relatives, with my parents receiving the house and $1 million. But there was more. A letter in Grandma's distinctive handwriting, addressed to me and dated just 6 weeks earlier, explained her reasoning. She'd watched my dedication to helping others through my social work career, my willingness to sacrifice financial gain for meaningful service, and most importantly, my presence during her illness when everyone else had stayed away. The letter described her pride in the woman I'd become and her hope that the inheritance would allow me to expand my charitable work. Attached to this letter were copies of forged documents that made my blood run cold. Someone had created an entirely different will, one that left me nothing while distributing my inheritance among my parents and Jessica. The forged signatures were skillfully done, but Grandma's real signature on the authentic will showed subtle differences that proved the deception. My hands trembled as I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned the documents to their hiding place. The implications crashed over me like a Colorado avalanche my family had somehow intercepted. Grandma's will created false documents and planned to steal my inheritance while convincing me I'd received nothing because of my supposed financial irresponsibility. The cruelty of their plan became clear as I remembered recent family gatherings where they'd made jokes about my unrealistic expectations regarding Grandma's estate. They'd actually been setting up my emotional preparation for disappointment, making me believe that Grandma thought I was too impractical to handle money properly. Over the following days, as I continued caring for Grandma while processing this devastating discovery, I began noticing other things. Jessica had recently purchased a new BMW, claiming it was a bonus from her marketing job. Harold had mentioned expensive golf club memberships and luxury vacations that seemed beyond their normal means. Patricia had been wearing jewelry I'd never seen before, including a diamond bracelet that must have cost thousands. The most heartbreaking part was watching Grandma's genuine affection for me during her final days. She'd pat my hand while I helped her with her medications, telling me how grateful she was for my presence. "You're the only one who really cares about people, Karen," she'd whispered one evening as I adjusted her pillows. "That's why you're so special to me." She passed away peacefully on a Thursday morning, holding my hand while I read her favorite psalms aloud. Her funeral was well attended, with my family playing the roles of grieving relatives perfectly. Jessica delivered a touching eulogy about Grandma's generosity and wisdom, never missing a beat despite knowing she was actively stealing from the woman she claimed to love. The will reading took place the following week in lawyer Marcus Davidson's downtown Denver office. As expected, the forged version was presented as authentic. I sat in stunned silence as the terms were read aloud, leaving me with nothing, while my family expressed surprise and sympathy for my apparent exclusion. "I'm sure Grandma Rose had her reasons," Patricia said with fake compassion, reaching over to pat my shoulder. "Maybe she thought you were still too young to handle that kind of responsibility." Jessica nodded sympathetically while exchanging meaningful glances with our parents. "Don't take it personally, Karen. Grandma probably wanted to make sure the money went to people who could invest it properly for the family's future." Their performance was flawless, combining manufactured concern with subtle implications that I somehow deserved my disinheritance. They'd had months to rehearse their reactions, making them appear genuinely surprised by the will's contents. During the following weeks, I watched them begin spending money with new freedom. Harold purchased a vintage Rolex he'd been coveting for years. Patricia hired an interior designer to renovate their kitchen with custom Italian marble. Jessica started talking about vacation homes and investment opportunities. Meanwhile, I returned to my social work position, throwing myself into helping families navigate crisis situations, while my own family had created the biggest crisis of my life. My small apartment felt even smaller as I processed the magnitude of their betrayal. They'd stolen not just money, but my grandmother's final expression of love and faith in my character. The mineral rights they'd stolen were particularly significant. Grandma's family had homesteaded 160 acres in Clear Creek County during the 1880s, receiving mineral rights that passed through generations. Recent geological surveys had indicated potential rare earth mineral deposits in that area, making the rights potentially valuable beyond their historical significance. For 2 months, I struggled with whether to confront them directly or seek legal advice. The evidence was clear, but proving their deception would require resources I didn't have and might destroy what remained of our family relationships. Part of me wondered if I should just accept the situation and move forward with my life. But Grandma Rose's voice echoed in my memory, reminding me about the importance of standing up for what's right. She'd often told stories about her own father refusing to back down when neighbors tried to cheat him out of his property rights. Sometimes, Karen, she'd say, while teaching me to balance her checkbook, you have to fight for justice even when it's painful. That's when I decided to contact attorney Sarah Whitman, a specialist in inheritance fraud, who'd been recommended by a colleague at Social Services. Our first meeting changed everything I thought I knew about my family's capacity for cruelty. Sarah Whitman's law office occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in downtown Denver, with panoramic views of the Front Range that seemed appropriate for someone who helped clients see clearly through deception. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 40s with auburn hair pulled back in a professional bun and intelligent green eyes that missed nothing as I spread Grandma Rose's documents across her conference table. "This is definitely inheritance fraud," she said after studying the papers for 20 minutes, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd handled similar cases. "But what concerns me is the sophistication level. Creating documents this convincing requires knowledge, resources, and connections that suggest this might not be their first time." Her words sent ice through my veins. "You think they've done this before?" Sarah leaned back in her leather chair, fingers steepled as she considered her response carefully. "The quality of these forgeries is professional grade. The paper stock matches official documents. The notarization appears authentic until you examine it closely, and someone clearly understood your grandmother's signature patterns well enough to replicate them convincingly. This level of skill usually comes from practice." She recommended hiring a private investigator named Thomas Chen, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes. Within days, Thomas began uncovering a trail of deception that stretched back decades and involved relatives I'd barely heard of. The first shocking discovery involved my great-aunt Margaret, who died 5 years earlier. Family stories claimed she'd spent her fortune on medical care and died broke, leaving nothing to inherit. But Thomas found records showing Margaret had owned substantial stock portfolios and real estate investments worth over $3 million at the time of her death. "The interesting thing," Thomas explained during our second meeting at Sarah's office, "is that your parents were named as executors of her estate. They filed probate documents showing minimal assets, but I found bank records indicating major transactions just before her death. My cousin Bradley had somehow inherited Margaret's vintage coin collection, which he'd claimed was worthless when she gave it to him before dying. Thomas discovered he'd sold portions of it to collectors for over $400,000 money that should have been distributed among all her surviving relatives, according to her actual wishes. But the most devastating revelation involved my uncle Richard Harold's younger brother, who died in a car accident 3 years ago. Uncle Richard had been estranged from the family after a business dispute, and we'd been told he'd left everything to charity out of spite. The truth was far more sinister. Your Uncle Richard did leave everything to charity, Thomas explained, sliding documents across the conference table. But someone intercepted his will and created false documents redirecting his assets to your parents. The charity he'd chosen, a veterans organization, never received a penny of the $500,000 he'd intended for them. The pattern became clear as Thomas continued his investigation. My family had been systematically defrauding relatives for over 20 years, using their positions as trusted family members to gain access to wills forged documents and redirect inheritances into their own accounts. They'd stolen from elderly relatives, grieving widows, and even charitable organizations. The total amount we can document so far exceeds $8 million, Sarah said during our third meeting, her expression grim. But there may be more victims we haven't identified yet. The most chilling discovery came when Thomas accessed their recent financial records through legal channels. My family hadn't just spent the stolen money on luxury items and vacations. They'd used it as collateral for massive loans. They had no intention of repaying, planning to default and disappear with the borrowed funds. They'd been planning this for months, Thomas explained, showing me loan applications and travel documents. Multiple mortgage applications using your grandmother's inheritance as down payments, business loans secured by assets they don't legally own, and credit lines that total over $12 million. Sarah spread out a timeline showing their activities over the past 6 months. They're building towards something big. All these loans have payment schedules that balloon in the next few months, suggesting they plan to default simultaneously and disappear before creditors can pursue them. The investigation revealed Swiss bank accounts, offshore shell companies, and property purchases in countries without extradition treaties with the United States. My family had been preparing to flee the country for years, using stolen inheritance money to finance their escape plan. The Aspen auction is likely their final step, Thomas concluded. Purchasing that estate would give them enough assets to complete their money laundering scheme. They'll sell it quickly to overseas buyers, transfer the proceeds offshore, and vanish before anyone realizes what happened. But the worst revelation was yet to come. Thomas discovered evidence that they'd been preparing to frame me for their crimes. Forged documents with my signature, fake bank accounts opened in my name, and manufactured evidence suggesting I was the mastermind behind the inheritance fraud scheme. They've been setting you up systematically. Sarah explained, her voice filled with professional outrage. If their plan succeeds, you'll face federal charges for crimes they committed while they're safely living in Switzerland with millions of stolen dollars. The evidence was overwhelming: fake lease agreements showing I'd been living beyond my means, forged investment documents suggesting I'd been hiding assets, and manipulated financial records implying I'd been coordinating the family's criminal activities from behind the scenes. Why me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as the full scope of their betrayal sank in. Because you're the perfect scapegoat, Thomas replied bluntly. You work in social services, so you have access to vulnerable populations they can claim you exploited. You're not married and don't have children, making you seem isolated and potentially unstable. And you've been the family outcast for years, giving them a believable motive to claim you were seeking revenge through financial crimes. Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. Karen, they're not just stealing your inheritance. They're trying to destroy your entire life while using you as a shield for their escape. The psychological impact was overwhelming. Every family gathering I could remember took on new meaning as I realized they'd been studying me, learning my habits and weaknesses, preparing to use my character traits against me in their final betrayal. My dedication to helping others would be twisted into evidence of exploitation. My financial simplicity would become proof of hidden criminality. But Thomas had more shocking news. During his investigation of the mineral rights Grandma had left me, he discovered something that changed everything. Recent geological surveys had identified rare earth mineral deposits on the original family homestead property worth significantly more than anyone had realized. The mining rights your grandmother left you, Thomas explained, pulling out geological survey reports, are worth approximately $12 million, according to current market valuations for rare earth elements. Your family doesn't know this yet, but they will soon. Sarah immediately understood the implications. If they discover the true value of those mineral rights, they'll accelerate their timeline. You need to liquidate those assets immediately and secure them before they can forge additional documents claiming ownership. Working with a mining rights broker, Thomas recommended I quietly sold the mineral rights to a legitimate mining company for $11.8 million. The transaction was structured to close quickly and quietly, with funds transferred to accounts Sarah had established specifically for this purpose. For the first time in months, I felt some measure of control returning to my life. The stolen inheritance money was gone, but the mining rights Grandma had truly intended for me were now safely converted to liquid assets that my family couldn't touch. Now we set the trap, Sarah said with satisfaction. They're planning to use you as their escape route, but instead you're going to be the reason they face justice. The morning of the auction arrived with the crisp mountain air that made Aspen feel like a different world from Denver. I'd driven up the night before, staying at a modest hotel while my family occupied a luxury suite at the St. Regis, their accommodations paid for with money they'd stolen from relatives who trusted them. I arrived at the Sotheby's auction house 2 hours early, ostensibly, to register for bidding, but actually to position myself where I could observe without being noticed. The registration process had been straightforward since I'd already provided the required financial documentation proving my ability to participate in high-value auctions. The auction house staff treated me with professional courtesy tinged with curiosity. My simple appearance contrasted sharply with their typical clientele, but my bank statements commanded respect regardless of my clothing choices. The registration clerk, a sophisticated woman named Amanda, who managed to look elegant even at 8 in the morning, processed my paperwork efficiently while making polite conversation about the day's featured lots. The Thornton estate is certainly generating significant interest, she mentioned while preparing my bidding paddle. We've received inquiries from buyers around the world, though of course many prefer to bid by phone for privacy reasons. I nodded politely while internally processing this information. Anonymous phone bidders could complicate my family's plans, potentially driving the price beyond their stolen resources. This auction would be more competitive than they'd anticipated. An hour before the scheduled start time, my family arrived in characteristic style. Harold had hired a black Mercedes sedan with a professional driver, creating an impression of wealth and importance as they stepped onto the sidewalk outside the auction house. Jessica wore a cream-colored Saint Laurent blazer over matching trousers, her blonde hair professionally styled that morning at the hotel's spa. Patricia had chosen a sophisticated burgundy dress that complemented her silver hair and expensive jewelry. I watched from my corner table in the preview area as they made their grand entrance, greeting other bidders and auction house staff with the confidence of people accustomed to luxury environments. Bradley followed behind them, carrying a leather portfolio that presumably contained their financing documentation and bidding strategy. They spent 45 minutes examining the estate's information packets, discussing renovation possibilities, and entertaining scenarios in voices loud enough for other bidders to overhear. Jessica mentioned hosting charity galas and corporate retreats while Harold talked about the property's investment potential and tax advantages. This estate represents exactly the kind of legacy property our family deserves, Patricia announced to a small group of acquaintances they'd encountered. We've been looking for the perfect mountain retreat for years, and the Thornton place meets all our criteria. Their confidence was absolute, built on months of planning and financial preparation using stolen money. They'd calculated the probable bidding range, arranged financing for amounts up to $10 million, and prepared backup strategies in case of unexpected competition. But as the auction start time approached, I overheard a conversation that made my blood freeze in my veins. I'd positioned myself near the ladies' restroom, which required passing close to where my family had gathered in the preview area. Jessica was speaking in hushed tones to our parents, while Bradley kept watch for approaching strangers. Their words were meant to be private, but the acoustics of the marble-walled space carried sound farther than they realized. The timing is perfect, Jessica was saying, her voice carrying an excitement that seemed disproportionate to even a successful auction. After we close on the estate tomorrow, we trigger Phase 3 immediately. Harold's response made my stomach clench with dread. Are you certain the evidence we planted in her apartment will be sufficient? More than sufficient, Bradley replied with satisfaction. The forged documents show a clear pattern of Karen manipulating elderly clients through her social work position. We've created bank records proving she's been stealing from vulnerable families for years, with all the money flowing into accounts we've opened in her name. Patricia's voice carried a coldness I'd never heard before, even during their cruelest moments of family ridicule. The FBI contact Thomas arranged will receive an anonymous tip Sunday morning reporting suspicious financial activities. By the time they investigate, we'll already be in Switzerland with the laundered funds. And Karen will be facing federal charges for elder abuse, financial exploitation, and conspiracy, Jessica added with genuine pleasure. The beauty of it is that she actually works with elderly clients, so the accusations will seem completely believable. My hands began trembling as the full scope of their plan became clear. They weren't just stealing my inheritance and destroying my financial future. They were preparing to send me to federal prison for crimes they'd committed while they lived in luxury overseas with stolen millions. The best part, Harold continued, is that she'll never be able to prove her innocence. We've been careful to create evidence showing she was the mastermind behind all our family's financial activities. Every inheritance we've redirected has fake documentation, proving she coordinated the fraud schemes. Bradley pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be photographs. I planted the last batch of evidence yesterday while she was at work. Her apartment now contains forged bank statements, fake investment documents, and manufactured correspondence that proves she's been running an elaborate elder abuse scheme for years. The cruelty was breathtaking. They'd spent months infiltrating my personal space, planting false evidence and preparing to destroy my life so completely that I'd never recover from their betrayal. Every invasion of my privacy, every violation of my trust had been calculated to serve their escape plan. Once the FBI arrests her, Patricia said with satisfaction, we'll have 72 hours before anyone thinks to look for us. More than enough time to complete the final transfers and disappear permanently. Jessica laughed softly, the sound carrying a malice that made my skin crawl. By the time she gets out of federal prison, we'll have been living in Switzerland for years. She'll never be able to touch us. Assuming she ever gets out, Harold added ominously. Federal charges for elder abuse carry significant prison sentences, especially when the evidence shows such extensive criminal activity. I retreated to a nearby alcove, my mind reeling from what I'd overheard. The auction was just the beginning of their final betrayal. Purchasing the estate would give them the assets needed to complete their money laundering operation. But destroying my life was equally important to their escape plan. For several minutes, I struggled to process the magnitude of their cruelty. These weren't just financial crimes motivated by greed. They'd planned my complete destruction with the same careful attention they'd given to their estate renovation fantasies. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned, every escape route secured. But as the shock faded, something else emerged, a cold, clear determination to turn their plan against them. They'd underestimated me completely, assuming I was the same naive family outcast they'd always known. They had no idea I'd discovered their crimes months ago, secured my own financial resources, and prepared for exactly this moment. The auction was about to begin, and my family was about to learn that their perfect victim had become their worst nightmare. As bidders began taking their seats in the main auction room, I checked my phone one final time to confirm that Sarah and Thomas were in position. The FBI agents Thomas had contacted were ready to move forward based on the evidence we'd gathered. All that remained was to spring the trap my family had unknowingly walked into. I took my seat in the back corner, paddle number 237 in my steady hands, and prepared to deliver justice that had been 3 months in the making. The auction room buzzed with anticipation as approximately 200 potential bidders settled into burgundy velvet chairs, arranged in precise rows, facing the auctioneer's elevated podium. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the assembled crowd, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that matched the extraordinary value of the properties being offered. Auctioneer Henry Morrison, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and 30 years of experience handling luxury real estate sales, commanded immediate attention as he approached the microphone. His presence radiated authority and professionalism, qualities essential when facilitating transactions involving millions of dollars and discerning international clientele. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Morrison began, his cultured voice carrying clearly through the state-of-the-art sound system. We're honored to present today's exceptional collection of Colorado luxury properties, culminating with the magnificent Thornton Estate in Snowmass Village. My family occupied premium seats in the third row, their positioning carefully chosen to maximize visibility and intimidation potential. Jessica had removed her blazer, revealing a silk blouse that complemented her confident posture as she reviewed the estate's specifications one final time. Harold and Patricia flanked her on either side, their expressions radiating anticipation and barely contained excitement. Behind them, Bradley had positioned himself to observe the competition while maintaining visual contact with our parents for coordination purposes. His leather portfolio lay open on his lap, revealing financial documentation and bidding strategies they'd spent weeks perfecting. Phone bidding stations lined the left side of the room where auction house employees would represent anonymous clients throughout the proceedings. 3 phone representatives had already activated their lines, indicating serious remote interest in today's featured lots. The mysterious nature of these bidders added an element of uncertainty that clearly made my family somewhat nervous. Morrison efficiently guided the auction through several smaller properties, establishing rhythm and building energy toward the day's main event. A luxury penthouse in Vail sold for $2.3 million after spirited bidding between a Texas oil executive and a California tech entrepreneur. A historic ranch property in Telluride reached $1.8 million before finding its new owner. With each successful sale, tension in the room increased as bidders prepared for the Thornton Estate competition. Morrison's assistant, a poised woman named Catherine, distributed updated information packets, while servers offered champagne and mineral water to maintain the sophisticated atmosphere. And now, Morrison announced as Catherine placed a large photograph of the Snowmass estate on an easel beside the podium, we present Lot 17, the extraordinary Thornton Estate. 20 pristine acres in Snowmass Village, featuring a 12,000 square foot main residence, guest cottages, private ski access, and unobstructed Elk Mountain views. The room's energy shifted palpably as serious bidders focused their attention on Morrison and prepared their strategies. Jessica straightened in her seat. Harold adjusted his tie and Patricia smoothed her dress while maintaining the composed expression she'd perfected for important social occasions. This exceptional property represents one of Colorado's most prestigious addresses. Morrison continued his description, highlighting the estate's luxury amenities and investment potential. Recent improvements include a renovated wine cellar, updated home automation systems, and professionally designed landscaping that maximizes both privacy and mountain vistas. Catherine distributed additional documentation to registered bidders, while phone representatives confirmed their clients' continued interest and bidding parameters. The atmosphere became charged with competitive energy as fortunes prepared to change hands. "We'll open bidding at $4 million, Morrison announced, scanning the room for initial responses. 5 paddles rose immediately, including Jessica's confident gesture from the third row. The competition was fierce from the opening moment, with bidders representing diverse backgrounds and geographic locations. A gentleman in an expensive Italian suit raised his paddle near the front, while a well-dressed woman in the center section signaled her participation. $4.2 million, Morrison called as multiple bidders remained active. $4.5 million. Jessica's paddle rose promptly with each increment, her confidence never wavering despite the strong competition. Harold nodded approvingly while monitoring the other active bidders, clearly pleased with their position in the early rounds. One phone representative, a professional woman with auburn hair, relayed bids from her anonymous client with mechanical precision. Her participation added an element of mystery that seemed to energize the room's competitive atmosphere. $5 million, Morrison announced as several bidders reached their predetermined limits and lowered their paddles reluctantly. The Italian-suited gentleman in the front row shook his head and withdrew from competition, leaving 4 active participants, Jessica representing our family, the well-dressed center section woman, and 2 phone bidders, whose identities remained concealed. $5.5 million, Morrison continued as the pace intensified, and the remaining bidders demonstrated their serious financial commitment. Jessica's response remained immediate and confident, her paddle rising without hesitation, while Harold and Patricia exchanged satisfied glances. Their months of financial preparation appeared adequate for the escalating competition, though I noticed Patricia checking her watch as if monitoring some predetermined timeline. At $6 million, the well-dressed woman in the center section reluctantly withdrew, leaving 3 active bidders in the final phase of competition. The room's attention focused intensely on the remaining participants as the auction entered its climactic moments. $6.5 million, Sasiu. Morrison called, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the extraordinary sums being discussed. One phone bidder dropped out, leaving Jessica facing a single anonymous competitor whose continued participation clearly frustrated my family's expectations. They'd anticipated multiple bidders, but hadn't prepared for sustained competition from a mysterious opponent with apparently unlimited resources. $7 million. Jessica's paddle rose again, but I noticed her conferring briefly with Harold before signaling her bid. Their confidence remained strong, but cracks were beginning to appear in their absolute certainty of victory. The remaining phone bidder continued competing with relentless determination, pushing the price beyond my family's comfortable range. Catherine Morrison's assistant maintained constant communication with the anonymous client while monitoring the auction's progression. $7.5 million. At this level, only Jessica and the mysterious phone bidder remained active. The room's tension became almost palpable as spectators witnessed a classic auction battle between visible and invisible competitors, each determined to claim the prestigious property. Jessica raised her paddle again, but this time hesitated briefly before committing to the bid. Harold leaned over to whisper something in her ear, while Patricia's expression showed the first signs of concern I'd seen all day. $8 million. Morrison announced, his voice carrying the gravity appropriate for such an extraordinary sum. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the culmination of 3 months of careful preparation and painful discovery. My family expected the phone bidder to withdraw at $8 million, leaving them victorious in their final step toward money laundering and escape. Instead, the phone representative immediately signaled another bid, pushing the competition to $8.2 million and beyond Jessica's visible comfort zone. My hand rose steadily, paddle number 237, catching Morrison's experienced eye as I entered the bidding war that would change everything forever. $8.5 million. Morrison announced, acknowledging my participation with professional composure, while a murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled crowd. The sound that escaped Jessica's throat was somewhere between a gasp and a choke as she turned to stare at me with undisguised shock. Harold's face went white, while Patricia's carefully maintained composure cracked completely, revealing the panic underneath her sophisticated facade. "What the hell is she doing here?" Bradley hissed, his voice carrying farther than he intended in the suddenly quiet auction room. Morrison continued the auction with practiced professionalism despite the obvious family drama unfolding in the third row. "Do I have $9 million?" The phone bidder remained active, signaling another increment, while my family struggled to process my unexpected participation. Jessica's paddle trembled in her hand as she faced a choice between continuing to bid with stolen money or admitting defeat in front of Colorado's elite social circle. $9.2 million, Morrison called as the phone bidder pushed higher. I raised my paddle again, my voice clear and steady as I called out, $9.5 million. The room erupted in whispered conversations as spectators recognized the dramatic family confrontation playing out before them. Morrison maintained order professionally while allowing the auction to proceed according to established protocols. Jessica attempted to signal another bid, but Harold grabbed her wrist and shook his head firmly. Their financial limits had been reached, their stolen resources exhausted by competition they hadn't anticipated. $9.8 million, the phone bidder countered, demonstrating continued determination to secure the property. My final bid silenced the room completely. $10.2 million. Morrison scanned the room for additional responses, while Jessica stared at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief that was almost comical in its intensity. The phone bidder conferred briefly with their anonymous client before shaking their head and withdrawing from competition. Sold to bidder 237 for $10.2 million. Morrison announced, bringing down his gavel with the finality that would change my family's world forever. But the auction was only the beginning of justice that had been 3 months in the making. The silence that followed Morrison's gavel was profound, broken only by the shocked whispers of spectators who'd witnessed something far more dramatic than a typical luxury real estate transaction. Jessica sat frozen in her chair, her face cycling through emotions ranging from disbelief to rage, to something approaching panic as the implications of my victory began registering in her mind. I stood slowly, my legs steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, and walked purposefully toward the front of the auction room. Every step carried the weight of 3 months of careful planning and painful discovery, but also the satisfaction of justice finally being served to people who'd betrayed every principle of family loyalty and human decency. Morrison extended his hand in congratulations, his professional demeanor masking what must have been curiosity about the family drama he'd just witnessed. "Congratulations on your successful bid, Miss Thompson. Please see Catherine for completion of the paperwork and transfer procedures." "Actually," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the auction room's excellent acoustics, "I have something to say first." The murmur of conversation died completely as 200 pairs of eyes focused on me with intense curiosity. My family remained in their seats, though Jessica had started to rise before Harold grabbed her arm and pulled her back down. Their expressions showed growing alarm as they realized I intended to speak publicly. 3 months ago, I began, my voice steady and clear. I discovered that my family had systematically stolen inheritances from elderly relatives for over 20 years, forging documents and redirecting millions of dollars into their own accounts while the intended beneficiaries received nothing. Gasps echoed through the room as the assembled crowd realized they were witnessing something far more significant than a real estate auction. Catherine Morrison's assistant quietly signaled security personnel, while Morrison himself maintained professional composure despite the extraordinary circumstances. The money they used to bid on this estate today was stolen from my grandmother, my great-aunt, my uncle, and numerous other relatives who trusted them with their final wishes. But more than that, they planted false evidence in my apartment and planned to frame me for their crimes while they fled the country with millions in laundered funds. Jessica finally found her voice, standing abruptly and pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. "She's lying. She's mentally unstable and has been making false accusations against our family for months." Her desperate protest only served to draw more attention to my revelations as spectators turned to stare at her with newfound interest. Harold attempted to pull her back into her seat, while Patricia's face had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup standing out starkly against her pale skin. "I've been working with the FBI for 3 months. I continued reaching into my purse to withdraw a small recording device that had captured every word of their conversation in the preview area. Special Agents Williams and Rodriguez are here today, along with investigators from the Colorado Attorney General's office." At that moment, as if responding to a perfectly timed cue, federal agents emerged from their positions throughout the auction room where they'd been posing as bidders and staff members. Agent Williams, a tall woman with short brown hair and an authoritative presence, approached my family's row while displaying her credentials. Harold Thompson, Jessica Thompson, Patricia Thompson, and Bradley Morrison. She announced in a clear voice that carried throughout the silent room, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, elder abuse, and interstate transportation of stolen property." The arrest scene unfolded with professional efficiency as multiple agents moved into position. Harold attempted to stand and protest, but found himself immediately surrounded by law enforcement officers. Jessica's earlier composure dissolved completely as handcuffs were applied to her wrists behind her back. "This is insane." Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with panic as Agent Rodriguez read him his rights. "We haven't done anything wrong. She's the one who's been stealing money from elderly people through her social worker position." His desperate attempt to deflect blame only served to provide additional evidence of their planned frame-up scheme. Agent Williams methodically recited the Miranda warnings while explaining the charges in language the auction room spectators could clearly understand. "You have the right to remain silent." She began her professional training evident in her calm delivery despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Patricia attempted to maintain her dignity even with handcuffs being applied, her voice carrying the imperious tone she'd perfected through decades of social climbing. "I demand to speak with our attorney immediately. This is all a misunderstanding that will be resolved once we have proper legal representation." "Ma'am," Agent Rodriguez replied patiently, "you'll have the opportunity to contact an attorney once you've been processed at the federal courthouse. For now, you need to cooperate with the arrest procedure." As my family members were escorted from the auction room, I turned to address the assembled crowd one final time. The money I'd used to purchase the Thornton estate came from mining rights my grandmother had legitimately left me rights, worth far more than my family had realized when they stole my inheritance. "I want everyone here to understand that I'm donating this property to the Colorado Foundation for Elder Care." I announced, my voice carrying a strength I'd never felt before. "It will be converted into a residential care facility for elderly abuse victims, honoring the memory of my grandmother, Rose Thompson, and all the other relatives my family betrayed." The spontaneous applause that erupted from the auction room participants was overwhelming their appreciation for both the dramatic justice and charitable gesture, creating an emotional moment that would be discussed in Aspen social circles for years to come. Morrison approached me with obvious admiration, his professional reserve giving way to genuine respect for what he'd witnessed. "Miss Thompson, in 30 years of conducting luxury real estate auctions, I've never seen anything quite like this. The property will serve a magnificent purpose in your grandmother's memory." As law enforcement officers completed the arrest procedures and began escorting my family members from the building, Agent Williams approached me with additional information that would complete the day's revelations. "Miss Thompson," she said, her voice carrying satisfaction at a successful operation, "I wanted you to know that we've recovered documentation of 14 additional victims of your family's fraud schemes. The total amount they stole exceeds $32 million over 23 years. The magnitude of their crimes was staggering, representing a level of betrayal that extended far beyond my personal experience. Families across Colorado and neighboring states had been victimized by people they trusted, their final wishes perverted by greed and calculated cruelty. Thanks to your cooperation and evidence," Agent Williams continued, "we anticipate federal sentences ranging from 25 to 30 years for each defendant. They'll spend the rest of their productive lives in federal prison." As the dramatic events concluded and auction house staff began managing the aftermath, I felt a profound sense of closure that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for all the innocent victims my family had betrayed over decades of criminal activity. The Thornton estate would indeed serve a meaningful purpose, providing care and dignity for elderly victims of abuse, while honoring the memory of a grandmother whose love had protected me even after her death. 6 weeks after the auction, I sat in the witness stand of the federal courthouse in Denver, looking directly at my family members as they faced the consequences of their decades-long criminal enterprise. The courtroom was packed with victims' relatives, law enforcement officials, and media representatives, covering what had become known as the Colorado inheritance fraud case. Judge Margaret Harrison, a distinguished woman with silver hair and 30 years of federal court experience, presided over the proceedings with the gravity appropriate for crimes that had devastated so many families. Her reputation for fairness combined with her intolerance for elder abuse made her the ideal judge to handle such an emotionally charged case. The prosecution team, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney David Chen, had spent weeks building an ironclad case, using the evidence I'd helped gather along with additional documentation discovered during FBI raids of my family's properties. The scope of their criminal activities had shocked even experienced federal investigators. "Miss Thompson," Attorney Chen said as he approached the witness stand, "please tell the court about your relationship with the defendants and how you discovered their criminal activities." My testimony lasted 4 hours, detailing everything from Grandma Rose's final days to the moment I'd overheard their plans to frame me for their crimes. The emotional impact on the courtroom was palpable as I described finding the hidden documents and realizing the scope of my family's betrayal. Jessica, Harold, Patricia, and Bradley sat at the defense table in orange federal detention uniforms, their earlier arrogance replaced by the grim reality of facing decades in federal prison. Their defense attorneys had advised them to maintain innocent pleas despite overwhelming evidence, apparently hoping for plea bargain negotiations that would never come. The prosecution had called 14 additional witnesses, relatives of fraud victims, whose heartbreaking testimony painted a picture of systematic elder abuse spanning more than 2 decades. Great Aunt Margaret's neighbor testified about suspicious activity around her house during her final illness. Uncle Richard's Veterans Organization representative described their confusion when his promised donation never materialized. But perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Thomas Chen, the private investigator whose research had uncovered the full scope of their crimes. His methodical presentation of forged documents, manipulated bank records, and fabricated legal papers demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that shocked even seasoned federal prosecutors. The defendants operated with the calculated precision of organized crime. Thomas testified his former FBI experience, lending credibility to his analysis. They identified vulnerable elderly relatives, gained their trust through family connections, then systematically stole their life savings through document forgery and identity theft. The defense attorney's attempts to discredit my testimony and suggest I was the actual mastermind behind the fraud schemes fell apart when FBI forensic accountants demonstrated that I'd been living within my social worker salary for years, while my family had been spending far beyond their documented income. Agent Williams testified about the evidence planted in my apartment, describing how the FBI had conducted surveillance of my family's activities for weeks before the auction. Her professional testimony destroyed any remaining credibility for their planned frame-up scheme. The defendants' plan to escape prosecution by framing Miss Thompson for their crimes represents one of the most callous acts of family betrayal I've encountered in 20 years of federal law enforcement. Agent Williams stated, her voice carrying controlled anger at the magnitude of their cruelty. On the 3rd day of testimony, additional evidence emerged that stunned everyone in the courtroom, including the prosecution team. FBI financial investigators had discovered offshore accounts containing over $15 million that my family had been preparing to access once they fled the country. These accounts were established using stolen inheritance money, testified FBI financial analyst Maria Santos, presenting documents recovered from Swiss banking institutions. The defendants had been systematically laundering fraud proceeds for years, preparing for permanent relocation to countries without extradition treaties. The most emotional moment came when Sarah Whitman, my attorney, presented evidence of my family's plans to ensure I would never be released from federal prison. Forged documents suggested I was mentally unstable and dangerous. Fabricated psychological evaluations claimed I posed a threat to other elderly clients, and manufactured correspondence implied I was planning additional crimes from prison. They didn't just want to frame Miss Thompson for their crimes, Sarah explained to the packed courtroom. They wanted to ensure she would never have the opportunity to prove her innocence or expose their criminal activities. Judge Harrison's expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted her questions, to defense attorneys becoming more pointed as their clients' culpability became undeniable. Federal sentencing guidelines for their crimes carried mandatory minimum sentences that would ensure decades behind bars. The victim impact statements were heartbreaking. 12 family members spoke about relatives who died believing their loved ones would be cared for through generous bequests that never materialized. Children described parents who'd sacrificed for years to leave meaningful inheritances that were stolen by people they trusted. Margaret Foster, great-aunt Margaret's daughter who lived in California, traveled to Denver specifically to address the court about her mother's betrayal. "My mother worked 2 jobs for 40 years to save money for her family," she said through tears. She died believing her sacrifices would help her grandchildren attend college. Instead, these people stole everything and used it for luxury vacations and expensive cars. The psychological evaluations ordered by the court revealed disturbing patterns of narcissistic personality disorders and complete lack of empathy for their victims. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic psychiatrist, testified that their crimes showed escalating antisocial behavior that posed continuing danger to vulnerable populations. The defendants demonstrate no genuine remorse for their actions, Dr. Warren explained. Their primary concern appears to be avoiding consequences rather than acknowledging the harm they've caused to dozens of families. When the prosecution rested its case, the defense attorneys requested a recess to discuss plea options with their clients. But Judge Harrison made it clear that the time for negotiations had passed, given the overwhelming evidence and the defendants' refusal to accept responsibility for their actions. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Jessica, Harold, Patricia, and Bradley were convicted of conspiracy to commit wire fraud money, laundering, elder abuse, identity theft, and numerous related charges, carrying sentences totaling more than 200 years combined. Judge Harrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but her comments during the verdict reading left no doubt about the severity of the penalties she intended to impose. The defendants' crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of family trust and human decency. She stated, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. Their actions have devastated innocent victims and corrupted the most basic bonds of family loyalty. This court will ensure that justice reflects the magnitude of their cruelty. As federal marshals led my former family members back to detention, none of them looked in my direction. Their earlier attempts to maintain innocence had been replaced by the grim reality of spending their remaining years in federal prison. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters seeking comments about the dramatic conclusion to a case that had captured national attention. But I had only one statement prepared for the media coverage that would follow. My grandmother, Rose Thompson, taught me that justice sometimes requires courage to stand up against people who seem powerful, I said, looking directly into the television cameras. These convictions honor not just her memory, but the memory of all the innocent people my family betrayed over the years. The final step in this journey would come at sentencing, when Judge Harrison would determine exactly how many decades my family would spend reflecting on their crimes from federal prison cells. 1 year later, I stood in the main living room of the transformed Thornton Estate, now officially renamed the Rose Thompson Center for Elder Care, watching staff members help our first group of residents settle into their new home. The 12,000-square-foot mansion had been converted into a residential care facility specifically designed for elderly victims of financial abuse, with 24 private suites and comprehensive support services. The morning Colorado sunshine streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating faces of men and women who'd suffered betrayal similar to what my grandmother had experienced. Each resident had their own story of trusted family members or caregivers who'd stolen their life savings, but here they'd found safety, dignity, and the support needed to heal from financial trauma. Mrs. Eleanor Davidson, an 83-year-old former teacher from Boulder, had been cheated out of her retirement savings by a grandson who'd forged power of attorney documents. She sat in the renovated library, formerly the estate's wine cellar, reading to a group of visiting children from the local elementary school. Her voice carried the strength that comes from surviving betrayal and finding purpose again. "The important thing to remember," she told the wide-eyed second graders gathered around her chair, "is that kindness is always more powerful than cruelty, even when it doesn't seem that way at first." Dr. Patricia Williams, the center's director and a specialist in elder abuse recovery, approached me with updates on our expansion plans. The success of the Rose Thompson Center had attracted attention from social service agencies across Colorado, leading to requests for similar facilities in other communities. We've received funding commitments to establish 2 additional centers. Dr. Williams reported her enthusiasm evident in her professional presentation. One in Colorado Springs and another in Grand Junction, both designed using the model we've developed here. The funding came from multiple sources, including restitution money recovered from my family's crimes donations, from grateful relatives of fraud victims, and grants from foundations dedicated to elder care advocacy. The total amount available for expansion exceeded $8 million, ensuring sustainable operations for years to come. Through the large windows overlooking the Elk Mountains, I could see residents enjoying the renovated outdoor spaces where professional landscaping had created accessible gardens and walking paths. The private ski lift had been converted into a scenic chairlift that allowed residents with mobility challenges to enjoy mountain views previously accessible only to the physically capable. Sarah Whitman had become more than my attorney during this transformation process. She'd evolved into a trusted advisor and close friend who shared my commitment to elder advocacy work. Her legal expertise had been essential in establishing the center's nonprofit status and navigating complex regulations governing residential care facilities. The Colorado Attorney General's office wants to use your family's case as the foundation for new legislation strengthening penalties for inheritance fraud. Sarah informed me during our monthly review meeting. Your testimony will be crucial in convincing legislators to take action. The legislative advocacy represented another way to honor Grandma Rose's memory while protecting future victims from the kind of betrayal my family had perfected over decades. The proposed laws would require additional safeguards for elderly people, signing wills or financial documents, along with enhanced penalties for family members who exploited their trusted positions. My own transformation had been as significant as the estate's conversion. 6 months earlier, I'd enrolled in law school at the University of Denver, pursuing a specialized focus on elder law and financial abuse prevention. My social work background provided valuable perspective on victim advocacy, while my personal experience with inheritance fraud offered insights that traditional legal education couldn't provide. The emotional healing had taken longer than the practical reconstruction. Therapy sessions with Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a specialist in family trauma, had helped me process the complex feelings surrounding my family's betrayal. The grief wasn't just about losing people I'd loved, but about discovering that love had been largely one-sided for years. Healing from family betrayal requires rebuilding your understanding of trust and relationships, Dr. Martinez had explained during one of our early sessions. You're not just recovering from financial crimes, but from having your fundamental beliefs about family loyalty shattered. The center's residents had become my chosen family, their resilience and wisdom, replacing the toxic relationships I'd lost through my family's criminal choices. Their stories of survival and recovery provided daily inspiration for continuing the work Grandma Rose had made possible through her hidden inheritance. Thomas Chen, the private investigator whose research had exposed my family's crimes, had joined our board of directors and established a consulting practice specializing in inheritance fraud prevention. His FBI background and investigative experience proved invaluable in developing educational programs for families and legal professionals. Elder financial abuse is significantly underreported. Thomas explained during a board meeting focused on public awareness campaigns. Most victims are too embarrassed or traumatized to seek help, while many family members don't recognize the warning signs until substantial damage has occurred. The media attention surrounding my family's case had created opportunities to raise awareness about inheritance fraud on a national level. I testified before congressional subcommittees, spoken at legal conferences, and participated in documentary projects designed to educate the public about protecting elderly relatives from financial exploitation. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of this transformation was the daily contact with elderly people who'd found hope again after experiencing devastating betrayal. Their courage in rebuilding their lives provided perspective on my own journey toward healing and purpose. Last month, I'd received an unexpected letter from Jessica in federal prison. Her first communication since the trial consisted of 4 handwritten pages, attempting to justify their actions and requesting financial assistance for legal appeals. The letter revealed no genuine remorse or understanding of the harm they'd caused, only continued manipulation and self-pity. I'd responded with a single sentence: "I hope you find the peace in prison that your victims have found in recovery." The letter had been forwarded to Dr. Martinez during our therapy session, where we discussed the importance of maintaining boundaries with people who'd forfeited the right to family relationship through their criminal choices. Forgiveness doesn't require maintaining relationships with people who continue to cause harm, Dr. Martinez had reminded me. You can release anger and resentment without exposing yourself to further manipulation. The sentencing hearing 18 months ago had provided closure when Judge Harrison imposed maximum sentences on all 4 defendants. Harold received 32 years, Patricia, 28 years, Jessica, 26 years, and Bradley, 24 years in federal prison. At their ages, the sentences effectively guaranteed they'd spend their remaining lives behind bars. Your crimes represent the worst possible violation of family trust, Judge Harrison had stated during sentencing. You preyed upon elderly relatives who loved you, stole their life savings, and planned to destroy an innocent family member to cover your tracks. Society requires protection from individuals capable of such calculated cruelty. Standing in the center's main living room, surrounded by elderly residents who'd found safety and dignity despite experiencing similar betrayal, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from transforming pain into purpose. Grandma Rose's love had protected me even after her death, providing resources that made this healing possible for dozens of families. The afternoon sun created golden patterns on the hardwood floors as residents gathered for their daily community meeting, sharing updates about family visits, medical appointments, and recreational activities. Their conversations reflected the contentment that comes from knowing they're valued and protected rather than exploited. Mrs. Davidson approached me after leading the children's reading session, her eyes bright with the intelligence that had made her such an effective educator before retirement. "Karen, dear, I wanted you to know that my granddaughter visited last weekend. She brought her children to meet me for the first time in 3 years. Her family had been poisoned against her by the grandson who'd stolen her savings, convinced that she was mentally incompetent and potentially dangerous. The center's family reconciliation program had helped rebuild relationships damaged by financial fraud and manipulation. She apologized for believing his lies about me." Mrs. Davidson continued, tears of joy brightening her eyes. "We're planning a proper Christmas celebration for the first time since this nightmare began." These moments of healing and reconciliation reminded me daily why Grandma Rose's sacrifice had been so meaningful. She'd endured my family's neglect during her final illness, but her carefully hidden will had provided resources that would help elderly abuse victims for decades to come. As evening approached and residents gathered for dinner in the renovated dining room, I reflected on the journey that had transformed the worst experience of my life into its most meaningful chapter. The pain of family betrayal had led to discovering inner strength I'd never known existed, while the legal victory had created opportunities to help others heal from similar trauma. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, who was attending a legal conference in Washington where our case study was being presented to federal prosecutors specializing in elder abuse. "Standing ovation after your video testimony," she wrote. "3 additional states are introducing legislation based on the Colorado model." The ripple effects of choosing justice over family loyalty continued expanding, protecting vulnerable elderly people across the country from the kind of systematic exploitation my family had perfected. Each new law, each educated prosecutor, each warned family member represented another victory for the values Grandma Rose had instilled in me. Looking around the transformed estate filled with people who'd found hope again after devastating betrayal, I understood that true wealth isn't measured in bank account balances or property ownership. Real abundance comes from using whatever resources you have to create healing and justice for people who need protection from those who would exploit their trust. Grandma Rose had taught me that lesson through her own example, choosing to live simply while building resources that could serve others. Her hidden inheritance hadn't just provided financial security. It had given me the tools needed to honor her values by protecting people who reminded me of her courage and dignity. The sound of residents laughing during their evening meal filled the mansion with warmth that no amount of luxury decoration could have created. These were people who'd survived the worst possible family betrayal and chosen to rebuild their lives with hope rather than bitterness. Their resilience inspired my daily work and reminded me that healing is always possible when people choose love over vengeance. As I prepared to leave for law school classes the next morning, I paused in the main entrance where a bronze plaque honored my grandmother's memory, Rose Thompson Center for Elder Care, where love protects and justice heals. The words captured everything I'd learned about transforming pain into purpose, choosing justice over revenge, and using resources to serve something larger than personal comfort. Grandma Rose would have been proud to see her final gift creating safety and dignity for people who'd experienced the kind of betrayal she'd faced from her own family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in law school, new opportunities to learn about protecting vulnerable populations, and new possibilities for expanding the center's work into additional communities. But tonight, surrounded by the peace of people who'd found healing after devastating loss, I felt the deep satisfaction of a life transformed by choosing courage over comfort. The journey from family betrayal to meaningful purpose had taught me that justice isn't just about punishment for wrongdoing, but about creating positive change that prevents future victims from experiencing unnecessary pain. Every elderly person who found safety at our center represented a victory for the values my grandmother had died believing in. And in the quiet moments before sleep, I could still hear her voice reminding me that love always wins in the end, even when the path to victory requires more courage than we thought we possessed. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Sometimes the people closest to us can cause the deepest wounds, but healing is always possible when we choose justice over silence. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how we can better protect our elderly loved ones from financial exploitation. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories about overcoming family betrayal and finding justice. Don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear that standing up for what's right is always worth the courage it requires. Thank you for joining me on this journey of transformation and healing. Remember that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to respond when life tests your values. Until next time, may you find the strength to protect what matters most.